This talk will draw on a fairly large chapter, so it's quite a condensed version. So I've written here that it probably misses some of the more nuanced parts of that chapter, so I apologise for that. But I'm also, thankful for this invite because in many ways it's helped me to kind of think of some new implications around that chapter, having to reread it and condense it into 30 minutes. And, as just said, I'm kind of just going into a copy editing phase, so hopefully I'll be able to squash some of this stuff back into it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read the introduction to the chapter, a slightly abridged version of it, and then I'm going to isolate 4 sort of components from the chapter to try and sketch out a little bit more detail for you. So, from the chapter, this chapter maps the brain's relation to recent trends in the management of efficiency in the digital workplace and sites of consumption. So the discussion is set against the backdrop of an ostensibly familiar discourse concerning a shift from Taylor to post-Taylor factory models. That is to say, an ongoing efficiency analysis caught in a transition from material to so-called immaterial labour. So the subsequent discussion is organised around 3 paradigms of computer work which have been reappropriated from the study of human-computer interaction. So I'll refer to that now as HCI. So the aim is to draw attention to the ways in which the workplace and consumer cultures have converged into a complex, circuitous, and exploitative mode of capitalism, which increasingly makes use of the brain sciences to root out the evils of inefficiency. So it must be noted that this is a distinctly political rendition of HCI, a discipline not usually renowned for its critical interventions into unscrupulous modes of workplace management. Indeed, HCI is more often than not complicit in these initiatives rather than confronting them. So this chapter observes as such the many continuities and discontinuities associated with a shift from muscular rhythmic entrainments of mechanised labour, analysed according to ergonomic, social and behaviourist psychological factors, to the introduction of cognitive and now more recently neurological models which have coincided with the digitisation of work and consumption. So I'll argue that despite a considerable shifting of ground, mainly brought about by changes to technology and scientific approaches to the brain, particularly around brain-body coupling, the goals of efficiency management to combat and conform bodies, minds and brains to the quickening rhythm of capitalism, that these remain quite consistent. Okay. Indeed, as ergonomics and cognitive sciences give ground to the neurosciences and digital technology becomes increasingly ubiquitous, the efforts made to exercise inefficiency and non-conformity, I'll explain that a little bit more later, from computer work has become more intensified. So this is a manifestation of what I'm going to call neurocapitalism, in which brain interactions are assumed to relate to emotions, affect and feelings, and decision-making processes, which are put to work in the fight against inefficiency. So I'm going to just isolate these 4 components to try and give you a little bit more detail of what goes on in the chapter. So firstly, I'll start off by asking myself a question: what is HCI? Well, I've worked in the area of loosely titled digital design for quite some time now, and particularly when I've gone into courses that have already been established, HCI is well and truly embedded in the curriculum. A recent trend in HCI is to call it user experience design or UX design in the UX industry. I'll explain that a little bit later. I've just noted here 3 particular things that I've observed over the years of kind of delivering this material and then trying to subvert and critique it. It's firmly rooted in origins around engineering, which claim to be pragmatic and atheoretic. It's a parasite. I don't think it's a subject that has its own conceptual framework. It draws off a number of other things and kind of reappropriates them for its own purposes. And it's most certainly a research remit which is largely focused on efficiency analysis of computer work. So we can begin looking at HCI through what is called the 3 paradigms of HCI. This is a fairly well-cited paper by Harrison et al., published I think in 2007, and it's widely available on the net. And they contend that there are three paradigms of HCI structured around a series of generative metaphors. So on the first hand, we have the ergonomic paradigm, which is a metaphor, or realized through a metaphor, of human-machine coupling. Of course, ergonomics is the natural laws of work. The second paradigm, the cognitive paradigm, uses the metaphor of the mind-computer coupling. And the third paradigm that they speculate about, and I'm kind of going along with that here, is all about embodied interactions with computing that situates users. So we hear terms like situated interactions. Now, Harrison et al. Call this a phenomenal matrix. Well, I have some kind of fundamental disagreements around the term phenomenal matrix, but I'm not going to go into that now. But I will say that I much prefer to call it the experience paradigm, which I think kind of captures it in a nice way. Mainly because it focuses on aspects of experience previously outside the margins of the cognitive paradigm. So these are experiences graphed through research into things like feelings, affect, and emotion, increasingly informed by the neurosciences. So from a workerist perspective, what is striking is how neatly the first two paradigms in Harrison's article fit into this Taylor post-Taylor discourse. But, and this is a question, what about the third? What about the experience paradigm? So various authors from within HEI have claimed that the cognitive term produced a much needed break from a dehumanizing human-machine coupling of the Taylor-inspired ergonomic paradigm. But, again, I make the case that some new concepts are needed to help to explain this shift towards the third paradigm, this experience paradigm. So to begin with, we need to think through the discontinuities and continuities of each paradigm shift. So firstly, there seems to be no higher deterministic authority or structure able to steer or capture the trajectory of each paradigm. So paradigm emergence has no downward causation as such. So each shift is defined by what escapes it. For example, the people who jump ship from normal to new. So a paradigm is a combination of mostly unpredictable variation alongside a gentle rolling out of undulating extensive invariance. This is something I think is quite missing in Harrison's article. So each paradigm of HCI is as such an emergence of metric extensive properties underscored by immeasurable intensive juxtapositions of the two things moving together. So, for example, the first paradigm is a combination of physiological, behaviorist psychology and social factors, but do not disappear from the ensuing paradigms, but persist and re-emerge in slightly different contexts. The third paradigm is similarly part of an enduring cultural circuitry that brings the territorializing forces of ubiquitous computing, emotion research, neuroscience, the utterances rather of design gurus, user experience consultancy, and the business school invention of the experience economy into an orbit with the otherwise shifting assemblages of capitalism. So, in a nutshell, paradigm shifts are complex. Okay, one consistent factor in HCI, however, is Taylor's desire to exercise the evils of inefficiency. So this begins, or becomes rather, manifest in each paradigm as a kind of a different research focus on, firstly, in the first paradigm, very much so, efficient bodies as they move through mechanized spaces. Secondly, in the cognitive paradigm, we look at the efficiency of minds as they process information flows. And thirdly, and this is a bit of speculative, but this is the idea of the third paradigm, but we're looking more at the efficiency of feelings, or maybe the efficiency of felt experiences, increasingly modelled, I must say, on the brain's emotional processing of experience, or loosely based on some of those ideas. So this latter focus on experience is being understood through the use of emotional ethnography, for example, and measured by way of rhythmic brain frequencies detected in technologies like EEG, and also body arousal, GSR, if you look at some of the research. So continuities and discontinuities also crop up in the diseases associated with each paradigm. So in the first paradigm, we have workplace fatigue, damaging whole body, hand, arm vibrations, conditions like white finger. In the second paradigm, we have a kind of split really between the bodily diseases and the cognitive conditions that come with computing. So there are, the ideas of cognitive overload leading to stress, caused by the kind of quickening rhythm of information glut in digital work. But on the other hand, there are still these physical, repetitive tasks and mechanical habits that are involved in computing, such as mouse clicks, keyboard taps, etc., and conditions like RSI. In the third paradigm, again, we enter into some sort of speculation here. What kind of diseases will emerge from that? What kind of fatigue in the workplace? I'm not the first one to suggest, but there are kind of diseases associated closely with brain function, like attention deficit, obsessive compulsive disorders, dementia and addiction. But I'll go into a little bit more detail in later work on that. Okay, the second component is Gramsci, and not Gramsci himself, but Gramsci's brain, and I'll try and explain that. So I'm not only just interested in Gramsci's critique of Taylor and Ford, however brilliant that is, but and how it can obviously be applied to each paradigm. But I'm more specifically interested in Gramsci's observation of a worker's brain in the workplace, in the mechanised workplace. So Gramsci's brain becomes something of what I describe as an aesthetic figure in the chapter, which kind of opens up the universe of each paradigm. So indeed, Gramsci has something quite unique to say about the brain's relation to work in a mechanised factory. And this is, again, going back into the book. So the tradesperson is modified by the scientifically managed assembly line, just as a child is adapted when he or she learns to walk. Like the child, the worker's physical motion becomes automated and their memory is reduced to simple gestures repeated in a tense rhythm nestled in the muscular and nervous centres. So that's Gramsci. Significantly, though, the memory of a trade is not grasped by Gramsci in terms of cognitive memory, but rather as a kind of muscular habituation. Once a child has learnt to walk, they can do so without thinking. Because thinking becomes surplus to the use in the act of walking, there is a kind of emancipation of the brain, Gramsci claims. So one walks automatically and at the same time thinks about whatever one chooses. So when the industrial adaptation of a trade person is complete, we do not find a worker with a completely mummified brain, according to Gramsci. So far from it, the brain reaches a state of complete freedom, unfettered for other preoccupations. This is, of course, a rather kind of limited freedom, obviously, but the mechanised factory reduces the worker to something that Gramsci calls a trained gorilla. Although clearly such freedom to think does not A, constitute absolute freedom from factory discipline, or B, help us to really grasp the role of habitual and cognitive memory in the workplace, it does nevertheless have a potential to lead to what Gramsci notes is the industrialist fear of dangerous thoughts of non-conformity. And you'd have to get into Gramsci to read more on that. But in many ways, what I think Gramsci does is kind of prefigure through his analysis of Ford, a kind of post-Taylor workplace environment, which is of interest here. So we look at Ford's kind of input on this. So indeed, Ford's education initiative programs links proprietary skill sets and primed competitiveness to thinking in the workplace very clearly. And Gramsci was interested in the kind of, the use of education, apprenticeships, etc. So the man who has the largest capacity for work, Ford says, and thought, is the man who is bound to succeed. Ford also recognises how the modern system of work required more brains for its operation than the old systems did, and there was a need, he contended, for better brains to run what he called the mental power plant. So I'm just going to focus a little bit on the second paradigm before I move through to discuss this important third paradigm. So the second paradigm needs to be seen against two shifting backdrops. So on one hand, there is a more progressively flexible and distributed computer production process available. On the other hand, the HCI research focus shifts towards psychosocial and cognitive aspects of labour. However, despite HCI's claim to have abandoned the dehumanising aspects of Taylorism, the digitised workplace introduces new kinds of routinisation and fragmentation ripe for efficiency analysis. So these also put pressure on brain time like never before. So the network surveillance of worker movement is also extended beyond the factory gates to locations previously outside of managerial control. Moreover, computing spills over into domestic and leisure time spaces and blurs the distinction between worker and consumer. Incidentally, it is during this second paradigm that HCI invents the new unit of measurement, the user. So the labour of the user is now reorganised along more distributed lines of cognitive production, while at the same time HCI branches out from physical and social factors to encompass an increasing interest in the cognitive processes of individual workers. So although often rhetorically embellished as focusing on aspects of user need, the second paradigm is arguably little more than a techno-psycho-social expansion of Taylorism, now informed by new insights from cognitive psychology. So HCI moves away from the worker grasped as a cog in the machine to a computer worker defined and organised around the central metaphor of mind and computer. That is a symmetric coupling of information processes, both user and computer. So the cognitive design of interactions at this stage is supposed to facilitate a rapid information flow between processors, on the one hand users, on the other hand computers. Information flows in and out of this coupling of processes, undergoing transformations as it passes through. And if anyone does HCI, you'll be familiar with the kind of diagrams that go with that. So this, or these flows could be manipulated to ensure a more efficiently communicated flow of information. So the brain time necessary for Gramsci's work or even to contemplate, let alone plan and execute nonconformist thoughts, is gradually eroded in this paradigm. Okay, slide 7. Claims made by the usability movement within cognitive HCI concerning a worker's capacity to act autonomously are not, unfortunately, concomitant with experiences in most digital factory environments. Buying online using a tablet device may have become a less frustrating user experience, but the seamless connection between the user-consumer and the disintermediated purchase only a few clicks away masks a rather grisly circuitry of worker exploitation. As widely reported in the media in the last few years, working conditions in Amazon factories, for example, and the role of the so-called picker point to stark continuities between the digital factory and Gramsci's trained gorilla. So this is a coupling of bodies, mind, and information flows that now require efficient movement not just through real but also virtual workspaces simultaneously. Workers have described these experiences with wearable tech as like being treated as a machine. We don't just think for ourselves, we plug our scanner in, we're holding it, but we might as well be plugging it into ourselves. The pitiless efficiency management of Taylorism is alive and well in the post-Taylor cybernetic factory, with the same increased risks of work-related mental and physical pathologies. So one component that I'll draw on the third paradigm, the experience paradigm, is this idea of Ersatz experiences, or the production of Ersatz experiences. So it's important to note, firstly, that alongside the digital expansion of the workplace, it is perhaps the HCI focus on user emotions like frustration that kind of usher in this new paradigm and these things that usually at the margin of cognitive HCI. Indeed, despite these bleak continuities with Taylorism, discontinuities begin to appear in a coming together of a pervasive digital technology environment, research into felt experiences, and a new burgeoning user experience marketing industry. On one hand of this coming together, this convergence, there is a new digital gateway to experiences. This gateway provides access via mobile devices to work communications, services like banking and shopping, as well as more intimate contact with colleagues, friends, and family on social media. So the experience paradigm is therefore part of some bigger trends in digital culture as a whole. So to begin with, as social media merges with the so-called Internet of Things, interaction becomes more seamless, wearable, locatable, trackable, and linked to an array of relational databases. Computing is starting to pervade and dissolve into the surrounding objects and environments in which work and consumption take place, or rather are experienced. This is a condition of Ubicom Adam Greenfield nicely describes as virtual reality in reverse. So HCI research is thusly pushed beyond the limited domains of the application and typical notions of what constitutes computer work. So on one hand, HCI starts to focus more on interpreting the relation between people and technology in terms of the felt life and the felt emotional quality of action and interaction. As already said, previously marginalised social factors concerning emotions, feelings and affect now figure writ large in HCI research. Significantly, this new research focuses, or this new research focus turns to the changing social context of computing, primarily informed by the emotional turn in the neurosciences. This marks something of a notable contra-Cartesian trajectory in HCI, greatly influenced by and made popular by Antonio Damasio and Joe Ladeau's work from the mid-1990s. It is this focus on emotional experiences and digital technology that seems to fuse HCI to interests in UX marketing. So evidence of the extent to which the emotional brain thesis has been adopted and adapted by this new UX industry can be seen in a number of popular publications, and some of these diagrams come from these publications. But one of the probably most prominent names in this area is Don Norman, who in around, I think, 2004 published Emotional Design, in which the former HCI expert and UX consultant, who kind of invented this term, working for Apple, argues that consumer engagement and loyalty can be captured emotionally. Borrowing directly from the kind of emotional brain thesis, Norman points to the significant influence of visceral, affective, interactive experiences and the influence they have on cognitive reflections and behavioural use. So then there is the so-called Brain Lady. It's a bit more of an obscure book, but if you do the UX circuit and go to any UXPA events in London, this is the kind of thing you encounter. The so-called Brain Lady's book, Neuro Web Design, What Makes Them Click. This is a very crude, in terms of neuroscience, but resolutely business-friendly triangulation of, on one hand, the emotional brain thesis. Second, a market-orientated approach to interaction design, which is becoming increasingly more prevalent, and an obsession with unconscious online consumption. So the experience paradigm does not approach the design of a commodity from a functional viewpoint alone, but rather designs for the emotional experience. It will work better that way, according to Don Norman. So the goal of the UX designer is to dissolve the product, the casing, the content and technical functions into desirable felt experience. The visceral level of experience, as Norman calls it, processes, is approached by way of a range of UX-centered empirical research methods intended to bring the emotional brain into the design and production cycle. So such techniques as emotional ethnography, empathy research, alongside biometric tests like GSR and EEG, are becoming increasingly part of the UX design or UX consultant's tool bag. So as well as the third paradigm of HCI becoming partly subsumed in this UX industry, it also belongs to Pine and Gilmore's experience economy. So this is a production process not born out of Ford's assembly line necessarily, but through the business of selling experiences in the same way that experience pioneer Walt Disney did through the concept of the amusement park. Indeed, if the experience paradigm were to be traced to Ford's trajectory, if we could do that, we'd probably end up with something more like Huxley's transcendental Ford, the College of Emotional Engineering working on the feeling experiences of the population. So to conclude this part on Ersatz experiences, I can see it as being a part of two broader components. So one, the UX industry brings into play neuroscientific ideas in order to tap into the sensory environments of workers and consumers. Here we see the production of mood environments in which feeling experiences can be captured and recycled. So this recycling of user experiences also allows for future experiences to be primed and usage anticipated. Secondly, experience design is dependent on a technological unconscious or a more neurologically orientated digital environment in which user performances are more rhythmically and seamlessly, efficiently attuned to the market. Neurocapitalism. I want to just begin here by some words of caution from Tiziana Terranova about the whole notion of what immaterial labour is. So as Tiziana puts it, immaterial labour cannot be dismissed as a simple quantitative transfer of surplus value from the factory to the upper floors of capitalist production. What it indicates is that the core of production now directly concerns the production of subjectivity, affects, desires, beliefs, aspirations, knowledges, and ways of thinking. So the experience paradigm is part of a broader move towards neuroscientific inspired ideas about how mostly unconscious subjectivities can be produced. This production of subjectivity becomes apparent in the cultural circuits of capitalism, channeled through, for example, the UX business seminar or the occasional TED talk. So indeed, Antonio Damasio's keynote appearance at a huge US neuromarketing conference a couple of years ago makes some of this circuitry highly visible. So neurocapitalism can be grasped through various interventions into brain work and brain rhythms. More specifically though, the third paradigm taps into neuroscience to model a digital subject rendered efficient, manipulable and somnambulistic at the level of brain processing. This is indeed a feeling encounter with the emotionally charged conditioning of Ersatz experiences increasingly channeled through the sensory environments of mobile media, gamified reward circuits, wearable tech, and neurologically managed attention spans. These new feeling encounters are the point at which the market pervades the freedom of Gramsci's brain to think non-conformist thoughts. But this is a complex circuitry in which HCI, the focus of HCI has become increasingly diverted away from the factory, the digital factory, toward the consumer's brain. So on one hand, what we now will call the UX industry deploys third paradigm efficiency analysis to consumption experiences. This is the kind of marketing power Stiegler has referred to as neuropower, a power exerted through attentive technologies that absorb the brain time of youth, turning them into what Stiegler calls attention engines. So neuropower introduces a decisive split between the objectives of critical thinking, in Gramsci's terms, to dare to think non-conformist thoughts, and the goals of marketing power. So on the other hand, though, it would seem that HCI, or rather UX, as we will now refer to it, doesn't give a damn about the plight of the Amazon picker. Taylor's human-machine coupling is alive and well in the digital factory, but there's no questioning from HCI researchers. Okay, and to conclude now, I'd like to go beyond the remit of the chapter, and this is what I'm saying. I've had a chance to kind of think a little bit beyond what I was trying to argue in this particular piece, and look at some particular recommendations for future HCI research. So firstly, I'm going to propose an HCI that tries to join up the various parts of this circuitry of what I've called neurocapitalism. This would be an HCI alert to the manipulation of consumer experiences, increasingly realised through the brain, emotional brain thesis. Also, an ethically aware HCI alert to the physical and mental stresses of a new digitised factory worker. In a word, HCI needs to care. Again, as Stiegler points out, in neuropower, people lose the capacity for critical thinking and resilience to market forces, nurtured through intergenerational systems of care. And I can see kind of, HCI being reinvented as a system of care rather than a system of carelessness. And finally, we might propose a more activist type HCI, aware that the brain of a consumer and a toil of digital factory work needs to be, as Gramsci argued, free to think non-conformist thoughts, and perhaps even celebrate a little bit of inefficiency in the workplace.
If I understood you correctly, you were focusing largely on the loop between the consumer and this new paradigm, which obviously is very significant. But is it not the case that there's also a kind of producer side version of this as well, in the form of latest trends in HR and attempts to use things like kind of sentiment analysis in the workplace. And so in terms of your kind of alternatives and the apparent lack of concern for, you know, the Amazon factory worker, without wanting to be even more pessimistic, is it not conceivable that this paradigm could enter both the production as well as consumption within what might be called a kind of wide-ranging employee engagement wellness packages focused on pulse rate, sentiment analysis, and all sorts of other things that try to keep the worker in a type of engaged, happy experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is part of a much bigger, broader thing than just a small remit of HCI, and that's really what I'm focusing on here. The idea that HCI has moved more into UX and looking at consumer is about interface design, you know, and being nice and, you know, user-friendly, cozy kind of environment. I think probably if you translate to the kind of things that are going on at work, and, you know, nudge was mentioned earlier, those kind of techniques, I think they probably will be there and will be designed as like third paradigm things, but they won't have such a pretty interface because HCI doesn't really give a damn about what things look like. I mean, you know, if you look at the wearable that the picker wears, for example, there's no real consideration about nice design. There's no emotion in that. But yeah, of course, this thing spreads out.
I'm just interested if you could elaborate on HCI activism. Where do you see that emerging? You know, who would participate in that form of activism? Well, so could you expand a bit?
This is quite close to me because I've been teaching this stuff for years. You know, I came back into education quite late as a mature student, and I took a kind of BSc-related computer technology course. And, you know, HCI was just taught to us because it was the kind of, you know, the default theory. There was no other kind of idea about, apart from learning a bit of programming and about hardware. You know, that's the theory you did. And I've been kind of going through a big transition myself in terms of teaching that stuff because it's embedded and it's there, and then turning it around and critiquing it through my other kind of approach, which is a digital media theorist. So yeah, I'm ready to start, and I am starting. It's very, you know, I deal with, you know, some undergrad level stuff, and, you know, trying to get them to sort of look at this stuff and critique their own kind of behaviour with computing, and look at this, you know, efficiency analysis of them. It's quite an interesting way to kind of get them to rethink, you know, their position in digital culture widely. So yeah, I was talking to someone last night about a Scandinavian HCI, which apparently is a little bit more radical. But the stuff, I mean, funny enough, Matt Fuller introduced me to this article, The Three Paradigms, and he suggested to me that there was some more radical stuff going on there. But I mean, if you're familiar with people like Paul Dorish, you know, I don't see any politics in that. It's interesting in terms of philosophical kind of take on HCI, but it doesn't really do anything in terms of, you know, intervening and critiquing. So, you know, I think something hard needs to be put in there. The reason why I put Gramsci in there.
Your discussion of Stiegler and your use of Stiegler, and in terms of just a really basic question, really, you know, are all these attentional technologies just kind of dulling? You know, is there not some? Can they not also create new capacity to think and act as well, or is it just to kind of?
Well, my work is very kind of negative, as you might have said. Of course, there must be some empowering things around this, and maybe that's a remit for a new HCI. I'll be a bit aware of the fact that, you know, different people react differently to this stuff. One of the criticisms I've had, you know, particularly work around TARD and talk about somnambulism, that sort of stuff, is that, you know, I tend to refer to kids a lot. And, you know, and Gramsci does that when he's talking about people learning workplace things. So, you know, I think we need to look at different ways different people will interact with it, and not this kind of uniform thing. And that's what the emotional brain thesis kind of misses a little bit, doesn't it? You know, that some people will be empowered by this, some people will go along with it. You know, there's like sort of 20% of people who can be easily hypnotised, you know.
Yeah,
but,
I guess
my focus seems to be very much on the kind of negative thing, and I'm sure there'd be some really valuable work doing something, you know, contrary to that. And that should be part of a new HCI, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. It was super interesting. I'm particularly interested in the efficient feelings, actually, something you have mentioned. I'm actually doing a work right now on wearable technologies, particularly focusing on mind trackers and neuro trackers. And I've been wondering if you've been, looking at these examples too, right? Because you have focused mainly on human-computer interaction here, and you said that this could be possibly a field where efficiency of emotions and feelings could step in,
well,
right,
course,
and be an important factor. But maybe some other examples, like how do you understand it? Could you elaborate on that a bit? Because, for me, I don't really see very clear relation, for instance, between neuro trackers and efficiency of emotions. However, I think my intuition is that it's going to go into that direction. So, if you could just talk a bit
I think
about
you're
that.
probably right, and wearables and people who are designing wearables are very interested in those kind of felt experiences. Of course, they are. More from a marketing point of view, of course, than maybe an HCI. Again, what I'm trying to suggest here is that this is something that HCI needs to investigate. Those kind of relationships between the marketing led desire to capture people's emotions and feelings. And use that to kind of create an overall experience, and the way that HCI maybe appropriates that. But maybe a bigger point on that is this sort of coming of the Internet of Things is kind of going ahead of HCI, so that's moving that direction. And I'm probably completely wrong here, but I don't know myself any HCI specific stuff around, for example, things that disappear into a tabletop or a chair that becomes a computer. Or more locatable things, and that again would be something that we need to be pursued. But I hint at that as that's where it's going. But I really don't do enough myself on wearables to know about that. But we had a conference recently at UEL, Affect and Social Media, and someone did a brilliant talk about a particular wearable, which was all about how you feel, and reporting that back to you and trying to say you're feeling good today, and it just strikes me as marketing, really, isn't it?
And I'd like to hear your, and I agree with you on many things, and that's a lot of what my work is on too. So my question to you is, do you see the resistance coming from outside of the UX and the HCI field when those fields are being, maybe not invaded, supplemented by the UX industry?
Right, okay. I won't name the university, but I did a talk which had Gramsci in it at an HCI conference. It was kind of I was at the wrong event, really. But these people, when I sort of said that this is probably a marketing takeover of your discipline, they didn't sort of realise it. They hadn't kind of got the grips with that. Patronising of me to assume that they hadn't. But and they didn't really get it. And I'd hate to sort of distinguish the kind of engineering, theoretic, pragmatic kind of approach that this particular discipline has grown from, and the way that it doesn't have this kind of internal criticism of itself. But you're absolutely right. UX now is not just becoming an industry which is subsumed HCI. It's now every company will have a UX department in there. It's an extension of marketing meets digital meets behavioural psychology, I suppose. Yeah. It sounds interesting, your thing. Just a note about ethnography. I do quite a lot of research into UX companies in London, and they do hideous things like they follow gamblers around, ethnographic studies. They get them to fill in diary studies, really to find out the points where they're most vulnerable. And this is all about online casino crap. So.
Lucy Kimball, University of the Arts London. I just thought, in addition to Will's point about the co-option of organisational resources, workers as well as users are also becoming co-opted in the designing and prototyping of products. And that's even now developing in the design of public services and so on over particularly the last 5 years. So I wondered about any linkages you saw between public service design, the co-option of users and their sort of hidden labour in helping government design services for them, and that then becoming more visible but also being used as labour for that.
I don't know much about that, but the one thing I do know is one of the big customers for UX are banks, and in a way, they're in demand because banks need to reinvent their whole kind of image post 2008, and so UX is working very, very clearly in that kind of area. But I don't know enough about internal work systems and the use of this. But only to say that UX now is becoming part of the kind of company structure, So, you know, these kind of hideous attempts to nudge us and whatever are kind of, you know, becoming more embedded in work practices. But it's not my expertise, that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a really, really fascinating talk.